February 11, 1952. 10:23 in the morning. A man with a stolen gun walked into a dress shop on Lenox Avenue in Harlem. What happened next wasn't unusual in a city where crime happened every day. What was unusual was what happened after. By noon, 200 people had gathered on the street. Not as a mob. Not with weapons. Just standing there. And that simple act, standing, watching, being present, forced the entire New York Police Department to abandon standard protocol. This is the story of how a community became ungovernable, and how a single captain made a decision that would reshape how power actually works in a city. But first, you need to understand what Harlem was in 1952. It wasn't a neighborhood that obeyed written rules. It obeyed unwritten ones. By the early 1950s, Harlem operated on a code that didn't exist in any police manual or legal statute. The code had 3 parts. First, don't steal from Bumpy's people. Second, don't disrespect Bumpy's territory. Third, don't ever touch Bumpy's wife. These weren't suggestions. They were mathematics. Break them, and the equation balanced itself. Not through courts or judges. Through streets. Mai Johnson had opened her dress shop in 1948 with money her husband provided. She wasn't just a criminal's wife running a business. She was the queen of that block. Customers came not just to buy dresses, but to be seen in a place that was safe, that was hers, that reflected the kind of success that black entrepreneurs in Harlem could build if they had protection and capital. The protection came from Bumpy. The capital came from Bumpy. The authority to exist peacefully on Lenox Avenue came from Bumpy. But that authority wasn't magical. It wasn't written anywhere. It existed because the neighborhood had agreed it existed. And agreements, even unwritten ones, have enforcement mechanisms. How Harlem actually worked. The police in Harlem in 1952 operated under a specific understanding. There were 2 systems of law. The official system, which was written in books and enforced in courthouses. And the street system, which was enforced through presence, through fear, through knowledge of what happened to people who broke the rules. Captain William Henderson had been working in Harlem for 15 years. He'd taken money from Bumpy Johnson for 14 of those years. Not large amounts. Just enough to look the other way when the numbers runners made their rounds. Just enough to make sure Bumpy got a phone call if there was going to be a raid. Henderson wasn't corrupt in the way that word is usually understood. He was practical. He understood that Harlem was a neighborhood that didn't want to be governed by outsiders. It wanted to be governed by its own people, by Bumpy, by the unwritten code that everyone understood. The alternative was chaos. Gang wars, constant violence, a neighborhood that bled into itself. With Bumpy in charge, with the code in place, there was order. There was stability. There was a kind of peace that came from knowing the rules and knowing that if you broke them, someone would enforce them. That system was about to be tested in a way it had never been tested before. Charlie Morrison was 32 years old, escaped from prison 6 days earlier, desperate, armed, and completely ignorant of the code. He'd been running since February 5, when he jumped from a prison transfer bus during a carefully orchestrated riot. 2 other inmates had escaped with him. They'd been recaptured within 12 hours. Charlie Morrison had made it to New York City with $7 in his pocket, a stolen guard's jacket, and no plan beyond going north until the world ran out. 6 days of riding freight trains, sleeping in rail yards, eating stolen food from corner stores, drinking cheap whiskey to steady his nerves and quiet the voice that kept saying he was going to die either in an electric chair in Georgia or on the streets of this city he didn't understand. Morrison was a KKK member. Had been since 1943, when he was 19 and angry and looking for someone to blame for the fact that his life hadn't turned out the way he thought it would. The Klan gave him answers. Simple answers. Wrong answers. Dangerous answers. But answers nonetheless. In August 1951, Morrison had killed a state trooper outside Valdosta, Georgia. 2 bullets in the chest during a moonshine run gone wrong. They caught him 3 days later. The judge gave him death by electric chair. Morrison had 3 months to live before they strapped him into that chair and sent 2,000 volts through his body. Then the escape. 6 days on the run. Then Harlem. Morrison had gotten lost trying to find Midtown. He'd taken a subway line he didn't understand, got off at 125th Street, and found himself walking through streets where every face was black, where store signs advertised black businesses, where the music coming from open doorways was music he didn't recognize. His racist brain told him to leave immediately. This was enemy territory. He shouldn't be here. But then he saw the dress shop. My Johnson's dress shop was prosperous. Well maintained. The dresses in the window were expensive. The kind of place that would have cash in the register. And here's what Morrison's KKK corrupted thinking told him: a dress shop in a black neighborhood run by black people would be an easy target. Women here wouldn't fight back. That's what the Klan had taught him for 9 years, and that's what he believed. Morrison was about to learn how catastrophically wrong that belief was. My Johnson was 41 years old on February 11, 1952. She'd been married to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson for 13 years. She'd grown up in North Carolina, moved to Harlem during the Great Migration, worked as a seamstress before opening her dress shop with money Bumpy had provided. The shop was empty that morning. Her assistant hadn't arrived yet. The first customers usually came around 11 o'clock. Mai was alone in the back room doing inventory, checking which fabrics needed reordering, making notes in her ledger with the careful handwriting of someone who'd taught herself to read as an adult. That's when the bell above the front door chimed. Mai looked up from her inventory, expecting her assistant. Instead, she saw a white man in a filthy stolen jacket stumble into her shop. He was looking around with the wild eyes of someone who'd been running for days. His hand was inside his coat in a way that Mai recognized immediately. She'd been married to a gangster for 13 years. She knew what a man looked like when he was carrying a gun and working up the courage to use it. Charlie Morrison pulled out the Colt 1911 semi-automatic, the stolen military-grade pistol he'd taken from an army surplus store in Philadelphia 3 days earlier. His hand was shaking from 6 days of alcohol withdrawal and fear, but the gun was steady enough to make his intention clear. "Empty the register," Morrison said, his voice tight and raw. "Right now. Don't make me ask twice." Mai looked at him. She didn't move toward the register. She didn't scream. She didn't do any of the things Morrison expected. She just looked at him with an expression that Morrison couldn't quite read. Not fear. Not anger. Something else. Something that almost looked like pity. "You're not from here," Mai said quietly. Her voice was calm. Steady. Like she was commenting on the weather. "I said empty the register," Morrison's voice cracked. He was used to people being afraid of him. The gun usually made people scared. This woman was looking at him like he was a child having a tantrum. "I heard you," Mai said. She still hadn't moved. "I'm just trying to understand. You're lost, aren't you? You don't know where you are?" Morrison felt his anger rising. The gun trembled slightly in his hand. "I know exactly where I am," he said. "I'm here to rob you." "You're in Harlem," Mai interrupted. "On Lenox Avenue. You walked into my shop. You pulled a gun on me." She paused. Tilted her head slightly. "Do you know who I am?" Mai asked. Morrison didn't. And that ignorance was about to cost him everything. "I don't care who you are," Morrison said, stepping closer, raising the gun. "You're about to be a dead woman if you don't." "My name is Mai Johnson," she interrupted. Her voice was still calm. "Does that name mean anything to you?" It didn't. Morrison had been in prison for months. Before that, He'd been running moonshine in Georgia and Alabama. He didn't know Harlem. Didn't know the names that mattered there. Didn't understand what I was trying to tell him. "I don't care what your name is," Morrison said. "Get the money now or I swear to God." That's when I said the 5 words that should have made Morrison run. The 5 words that contained the entire weight of Harlem's code, compressed into a moment of perfect clarity. "You just made a terrible mistake." Her voice didn't change. Didn't get louder. Didn't get threatening. She said it like she was informing him of a simple fact. Like telling someone they'd stepped in dog shit on the sidewalk. Unfortunate, but not her problem to solve. What Charlie Morrison didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that information in Harlem moved faster than police could respond to crimes. I walked to the telephone on the counter and dialed a number she'd memorized. A man answered almost immediately. It was the manager of Small's Paradise, the nightclub where Bumpy Johnson held court every day. "It's me," I said quietly. "I need you to tell him something. Tell him the roses need watering. The shop is closed early today." She hung up. The message had taken 7 seconds to send. It would take 30 seconds to reach Bumpy. The entire police apparatus of New York City, with its dispatchers and radio networks and chain of command, would take at least 15 minutes to respond to a robbery report. By the time the first patrol car arrived at Mai's dress shop, the message had already reached Bumpy Johnson. By the time a supervisor arrived on scene, Bumpy would be getting into a car. By the time Captain Henderson decided how to respond, there would already be 70 people on the street. This was how Harlem actually worked. This was why the unwritten code was more powerful than written law. Information didn't move through bureaucracy. It moved through neighborhood. And neighborhood moved through loyalty. Police received the call at 10:47 a.m. A woman dispatcher noted a robbery in progress at a dress shop on Lenox and 135th. She dispatched 2 units. They arrived at 10:51 a.m. By that time, there were already 40 people on the street. By 11:15 a.m., when Captain Henderson arrived, there were 200 people standing on Lenox Avenue. Not as a mob. Not with weapons. Not threatening anything. Just standing there. Mothers with children. Old men in suits. Young people in work clothes. Store owners who'd closed their shops to come see what was happening. They filled the street, standing between the police and Mai's shop. Not preventing police from doing their job. Just being present. Witnessing. Making it clear that this wasn't abstract law enforcement. This was something that mattered to the community. Henderson knew what was happening. He'd been in Harlem long enough to understand the politics. He'd taken money from Bumpy Johnson for 15 years, specifically for moments like this. He'd developed an understanding. When there was a situation involving Bumpy or Bumpy's people, you didn't move aggressively. You let the community handle it. You maintained presence, but you didn't interfere. This was a negotiation between systems. Between the written law and the street law. Between the police and the neighborhood. And Henderson understood, without being told, that the neighborhood was about to win. Inside the dress shop, Charlie Morrison was deteriorating. The reality of his situation was sinking in. He'd taken a hostage. Cops outside. No way out. And this woman, Mai, she wasn't crying or begging. She was just waiting. Calm. Like she knew something Morrison didn't. "Why aren't you scared?" Morrison finally asked her around 2 p.m. They'd been there for almost 4 hours. Mai looked at him with an expression he still couldn't read. "Because this ends the same way no matter what you do," she said quietly. "The only question is whether you're smart enough to surrender before my husband gets here." Morrison's hands trembled. He was a man who'd killed before. He'd shot a state trooper. He'd gotten used to the weight of violence, the idea that having a gun made you powerful. But this woman wasn't responding to any of that. She was responding to something he didn't understand. "You told me I don't care about your," Morrison tried to interrupt. "You should," Mai said. Her voice was still calm. Still steady. "Bumpy Johnson is the most powerful man in Harlem. He's killed men for less than this. And you grabbed his wife, put a gun to her head in his own neighborhood." She paused. "Let that sink in. Let that sink in," she repeated, as if reading his mind. "You're not in Georgia anymore. You're not in some small town where no one cares what happens. You're in Harlem. On a street where 200 people just showed up to make sure you don't disappear." Morrison looked out the window. The crowd had grown. He could see faces. Could see how they were organized without being organized. Just present. Just watching. "I can't go back," Morrison said. His voice cracked. "I can't. That chair." "You're going back either way," Mai said. Her voice was almost gentle now. "But you can go back in one piece. That's the choice." At 3:42 p.m., the telephone in the shop rang. Morrison jumped, stared at it. He almost didn't answer. But the phone kept ringing, and Mai had moved to answer it herself, and Morrison realized he was losing control of the situation. He picked it up. Captain Henderson's voice came through, tight with a tension Morrison had never heard before. "Morrison, this is Captain Henderson. How's Mrs. Johnson?" "She's alive," Morrison said. "She stays that way if you give me what I want," Morrison heard his own voice say, but it sounded weak now. Desperate. "And what do you want?" Henderson asked. "A car. Safe passage to Canada." "I can't do that, Morrison. You need to let Mrs. Johnson go right now." There was a pause. Then Henderson's voice came again, quieter now. Different. Like he was about to tell Morrison something Morrison didn't want to hear. "You need to let Mrs. Johnson go right now. Not because of the law, Morrison. Because Bumpy Johnson just arrived." The blood in Morrison's body seemed to stop moving. "What?" he whispered. "Bumpy Johnson is here," Henderson said. "He's standing in the street." "And Morrison," Henderson paused. "I've worked in Harlem for 15 years. I've seen what this man does to people who cross him. You're already on death row. Don't make your last days on earth worse than they have to be. Let her go. Surrender. We'll get you back to Georgia. At least that way it's fast." Morrison moved to the window. The crowd had parted. Like water dividing, creating a path. And walking down that path, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned every inch of ground he stepped on, was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was 45 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall. Not a big man physically. But the way he moved, the way every single person in that crowd stepped back as he passed, made him seem enormous. He wore a gray suit, perfectly tailored. A fedora. Shoes polished like mirrors. He looked like a businessman heading to a meeting. Except for his face. His face was something else entirely. What happened next was the real story. Not the confrontation. Not the violence. But the moment when Captain Henderson realized that his authority, the authority of the New York Police Department, of written law, of institutional power, had just been superseded by something else. Bumpy stopped 10 feet from the shop door. He reached into his jacket. Every cop on the street tensed, hands moving toward weapons. But Bumpy didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a straight razor. The old-fashioned kind. The kind barbers used. The kind that could shave a man's face smooth or open his throat from ear to ear. He opened the razor with a practiced flick of his wrist. Click. That sound carried across the silent street. Metal on metal. Sharp. Final. Bumpy looked directly at the window where he knew Morrison was watching. Then he turned to Captain Henderson. "Captain," Bumpy said. His voice was quiet. But in the silence of that street, everyone heard every word. "I'm going to give you some advice. In about 2 minutes, I'm going through that door. What happens after that, you don't want your officers to witness. You don't want them writing reports about what they saw. You don't want them testifying in court." Henderson didn't respond immediately. He was a career cop. 30 years on the force. He knew the protocols. He knew what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to prevent vigilante action. He was supposed to maintain the sanctity of law. But he also understood something that civilians don't understand. Sometimes the law isn't the highest authority in a place. Sometimes the street is. "Mr. Johnson," Henderson said carefully. "This is a police matter. I can't just." "You can," Bumpy interrupted. Still quiet. Still calm. "You can tell your men to maintain a perimeter but hold position. You can tell them that if they hear anything, they wait 30 seconds before entering." 30 seconds, Captain. That's all I need." Henderson looked at the crowd. 200 people. Then he looked at Bumpy. Then he looked at his own officers, who were waiting for orders. He made a calculation that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with survival. "Officers," Henderson called out. His voice tight. "Fall back to the end of the block. Maintain visual on the building, but do not approach unless I give the order." "Captain, we can't just," one officer started. "That's an order," Henderson said. The cops retreated slowly, reluctantly. Not completely gone. But far enough that they couldn't see clearly through the shop's windows. Far enough that they could later claim they didn't witness what happened next. The crowd didn't move. Didn't make a sound. Just stood there, watching, making sure that whatever happened in that shop was not an act of a single man, but an act that the entire neighborhood had authorized. Bumpy walked to the shop door, tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back and called out toward the window. His voice was conversational now. Like he was explaining something. "Morrison, you've got 2 choices," Bumpy said. "Choice 1, you open this door right now. You let my wife walk out unharmed. Not a hair on her head touched. You do that, I let Captain Henderson arrest you. You go back to Georgia. They execute you clean. Quick. You don't suffer." Bumpy paused. "Choice 2, he continued. I come through this door myself. And before you go back to Georgia, you spend a few days in a Harlem hospital wishing you'd chosen option 1. The doctors will keep you alive. Barely. Long enough for Georgia to come get you. But you'll spend every second understanding exactly what happens when someone forgets the rules." Inside the shop, Morrison was shaking. The gun trembled in his hand. "He's bluffing," Morrison whispered to Mai. "He won't. He can't just." Morrison realized too late that he was not in control. Mai Johnson told him the truth plainly: Georgia would execute him no matter what he did. The only choice left was how this moment ended. Faced with his wife, the door, and the gun in his hand, Morrison thought about the ideology that had promised him power and immunity, about how easy it was supposed to be. And he understood how completely wrong that belief had been. He opened the door, put down the gun, and surrendered. The police arrested him. An official report later softened the truth, because institutions often protect themselves before they protect honesty. Morrison was returned to Georgia and executed 3 months later. But this was never really his story. The real story was Lenox Avenue. 200 people standing silently proved something fundamental: written law and street law coexist, but they are not equal. Community protection can outweigh institutional authority. When an institution lacks legitimacy, loyalty, and numbers, it must negotiate, or retreat. Captain Henderson understood this. For years, he had accepted Harlem's self-governance, not out of corruption but pragmatism. On February 11, 1952, he acknowledged what was already true: Harlem protected its own. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. But something essential shifted, in how police understood certain neighborhoods, in how criminals understood power, and in how a community understood responsibility. This was not a story about violence or a crime boss. It was about authority and how it actually functions. Mai Johnson needed only one phone call because she understood the system. 200 people showed up, not to threaten, but to be present, to make clear that this was personal, communal, and non-negotiable. Power here was not weapons or fear. It was loyalty. Presence. Systems that worked because people believed in them. Morrison's mistake was not the crime itself, but committing it in a place where the crime insulted an entire community. And communities respond not with chaos, but with unity. In Harlem, in 1952, that unity was stronger than any law written on paper.